We are taught that wars begin with violence, with a gunshot, with an explosion, with a border crossed at dawn. An assassination sparks World War I. A surprise attack pulls the United States into World War II. A missile launch ignites a modern conflict. This is the story we are told, because it is simple, dramatic, and comforting. It allows us to believe that war is a sudden accident, a failure of diplomacy, a moment of madness. But history tells a far more disturbing story. Wars do not begin on the battlefield. They begin quietly, invisibly, years earlier, inside balance sheets, bond markets, and central bank ledgers. They begin when money stops doing what it is supposed to do. Because money is not just numbers on a screen. Money is trust. It is a promise that effort today will still have value tomorrow. And when that promise breaks, societies don't simply adjust, they fracture. Long before the first soldier moves, something else happens. Debt piles up faster than growth. Trade becomes fragile. Currencies lose credibility. And governments find themselves trapped by arithmetic they can no longer escape. At that point, war stops being unthinkable. It becomes useful. War erases debts. War justifies printing money. War redirects anger away from leaders and toward enemies. War turns economic failure into patriotic sacrifice. This is not theory. This is pattern. In 1914, the world was more interconnected than ever before, through trade, finance, and capital flows. It was also drowning in debt. When the financial system cracked, war followed. In 1939, global trade collapsed, currencies failed, and nations turned inward. What came next reshaped the entire century. Today we like to believe we are more advanced, more rational, more stable. But look closer. Global debt has reached levels never seen in human history. Trust in currencies is eroding. Trade is fragmenting into hostile blocks. Sanctions have replaced diplomacy. And financial systems are being weaponized. The year approaching us is not random. It is not superstition. It is math. 2026 is not important because of prophecy. It is important because of schedules, maturities, and compounding interest. This is not a story about fear. It is a story about inevitability. Because when money fails, history shows us again and again what replaces it. And right now, the world is standing exactly where it stood before. At the edge of a financial system that no longer works. We like to think of war as tanks, planes, and soldiers. But the most important battles of the modern world are fought far from the front lines. They are fought in bond markets, in currency exchanges, in payment systems and clearing houses. Because in the 21st century, money is the battlefield. For decades, the global financial system was built on a single assumption: trust. Trust that debts would be honored. Trust that trade would remain open. Trust that money would retain its value. This trust allowed the world to become deeply interconnected. Supply chains stretched across continents. Nations specialized instead of self-sustaining. Efficiency replaced resilience. And as long as money worked, the system held. But beneath the surface, something dangerous was growing. Debt was expanding faster than real economic output. Governments borrowed not to build, but to maintain the illusion of stability. Central banks suppressed interest rates, making borrowing feel painless, even responsible. It created a world addicted to cheap money. Corporations survived not because they were productive, but because debt was cheap. Governments avoided hard choices by refinancing old obligations with new promises. Entire economies were built on the assumption that tomorrow would always be easier than today. It never is. At a certain point, debt stops being a tool and becomes a trap. Interest payments grow faster than tax revenues. Refinancing replaces repayment. And the system survives only as long as confidence does. This is the moment when money starts to fail, not suddenly but structurally. Trade begins to fracture. Alliances become transactional. And financial leverage turns into political pressure. Currencies, once neutral instruments of exchange, become weapons. Access to capital becomes conditional. Payment systems become tools of coercion. Sanctions replace negotiations. And slowly, almost invisibly, the global economy transforms into a zero-sum game. In a zero-sum world, cooperation is weakness. Dependence is vulnerability. And self-sufficiency becomes power. This is how financial stress turns into geopolitical tension. Not because leaders want war, but because the system leaves them fewer and fewer peaceful options. When money no longer solves problems, force begins to look like the last remaining tool. The battlefield is already prepared. The lines are already drawn. The only thing missing is the spark. And history tells us that sparks rarely come from ideology. They come from pressure. History does not surprise us. It warns us, quietly, repeatedly, until we choose to ignore it. In 1914, the world believed it was entering a golden age. Trade was global. Capital flowed freely. Technology was transforming society at unprecedented speed. London was the financial center of the world. The British pound was the global reserve currency. The system looked stable. It looked permanent. It wasn't. Britain was an empire in decline, burdened by debt and the cost of maintaining its dominance. At the same time, a rising industrial power was challenging that dominance, Germany. Germany had the factories, the technology, the productivity, but it did not control the financial system. Access to credit, trade routes, and gold was mediated by London and its allies. Financial power was used to contain economic growth. Expansion through markets was blocked. The message was clear: grow within the system or not at all. Germany eventually reached the same conclusion every rising power reaches under financial siege. If the system will not allow you to grow, the system must be broken. When financial channels closed, military channels opened. The war began long before the first shot was fired. The same pattern repeated in the 1930s. After World War I, the global economy was held together by fragile debts and unstable trade arrangements. When the Great Depression hit, nations turned inward. Currencies collapsed. Trade barriers rose. Economic survival became a national priority. Japan, cut off from oil and steel through sanctions, faced an impossible calculation. Accept economic suffocation or act. They chose war. Not because they believed it was safe, but because they believed it was inevitable. This is the lesson history keeps offering, and we keep refusing to learn. When an established power uses financial control to contain a rising power, tension does not disappear. It compounds. Eventually, war stops being a choice. It becomes the release valve. Today the names have changed, but the structure has not. Replace Britain with the United States. Replace Germany with China. Replace gold with the US dollar. The board is the same. The pieces are moving, and the pressure is building. History isn't repeating. It's rhyming, with increasing precision. The driving force of the coming crisis is not ideology. It is arithmetic. We are living inside the largest debt experiment in human history. And like all experiments that ignore limits, it is reaching its breaking point. Global debt now exceeds $300 trillion. That is more than 3 times the world's annual economic output. In simple terms, the world owes far more than it can ever realistically repay. In the past, this would have been resolved through recession. Weak companies would fail. Bad debts would be written off. The system would reset. But this time is different. Governments are no longer the rescuers. They are the problem. The United States carries tens of trillions in debt. Japan's obligations dwarf its economy. Europe survives on perpetual refinancing. This is the sovereign debt supercycle. A phase where the largest borrowers are the only institutions that cannot be allowed to fail. And that creates a trap. Governments cannot go bankrupt the way businesses do. When the bills come due, they are left with only 3 options: cut spending and risk social collapse, default and shatter the global financial system, or inflate the debt away. History shows us which option is chosen. Inflation is politically convenient. And when inflation is not enough, war follows. War provides cover for financial destruction. It allows governments to print without restraint. It transforms economic pain into patriotic duty. And it makes foreign creditors expendable. This is why financial crises so often precede major wars. Not because leaders are reckless, but because the system leaves them no clean exit. Every year the pressure builds. Every refinancing pushes the problem forward. And every delay makes the eventual reckoning larger. The math does not care about ideology. It does not negotiate. It does not forgive. At some point the numbers stop working. And when they do, politics gives way to power. For most of the modern era, the US dollar was not seen as a weapon. It was a utility. Like the oceans. Like global shipping lanes. Like the internet. Countries used it not because they loved the United States, but because it was stable, liquid, and trusted. That trust was the foundation of the global order. But something changed. Over the past decade, money stopped being neutral. Access to the financial system became conditional. Payment rails became tools of enforcement. The turning point came when central bank reserves, once considered untouchable, were frozen. With a keystroke, hundreds of billions vanished from a sovereign balance sheet. The message was unmistakable. Your money is safe, until it isn't. From that moment on, every nation understood the same thing. Financial dependence was no longer efficiency. It was vulnerability. This triggered a silent global shift. Countries began searching for alternatives. New payment systems, bilateral trade agreements, gold accumulation at levels not seen in generations. Not because these systems were better, but because dependence on a single financial center had become dangerous. Sanctions, once viewed as diplomatic tools, began to resemble sieges. And history is very clear about sieges. A nation cut off from money is cut off from food, medicine, technology, and energy. It is pushed into a corner. And a cornered nation does not compromise, it lashes out. This is how economic pressure turns into military calculation. At the same time, China faces a crisis of its own. Its economic miracle was built on exports, real estate, and debt. That model is breaking down. Growth is slowing. Demographics are turning hostile. And internal stability is no longer guaranteed. For a system built on perpetual expansion, stagnation is existential. Political legitimacy begins to shift from prosperity to nationalism. From growth to confrontation. This is what strategists call the peaking power moment. The point where a rising nation realizes it may never be stronger than it is right now. And that realization is dangerous. Because when time stops working in your favor, patience disappears. Why 2026? Why not later? Why not sooner? Because crises are not random. They arrive on schedules. During the pandemic years of 2020 and 2021, the world did something unprecedented. Governments and corporations borrowed trillions of dollars at near zero interest rates. Money was cheap. Risk felt distant. 5-year loans became the instrument of choice. Why not lock in free money? Now do the math. 2021 plus 5 years leads directly to 2026. That is when the bill comes due. In that year, a massive wall of corporate and sovereign debt must be refinanced. But it will not be refinanced at 0%. It will be rolled over at 5, 6, even 7%. Interest costs will double, then triple. Overnight. Thousands of companies exist today only because cheap debt keeps them alive. They do not generate enough profit to survive in a normal interest rate environment. These are the so-called zombie companies. When refinancing fails, bankruptcies surge. When bankruptcies surge, banks absorb the shock. And when banks weaken, confidence evaporates. This is how liquidity crises are born. Central banks will face a familiar choice. Allow the system to collapse into a depression. Or print money to stop the bleeding. History tells us exactly what they will choose. They will print. But printing trillions in a world with fractured supply chains does not create growth. It destroys purchasing power. Currencies weaken. Imports become expensive. Living standards fall. And when a government can no longer project power through money, it turns to force. By 2026, the economic cushion that has delayed reckoning will be gone. What remains will be debt, tension, and desperation. This is not the cause of conflict. It is the accelerant. When financial systems fail, they don't fail on screens. They fail in real life. ATMs stop working. Credit cards are declined. Savings lose meaning. And promises written in contracts dissolve overnight. Because finance is not abstract. It is a claim on real things. Food, energy, materials, labor. And when trust in money breaks, those claims become worthless. You cannot eat a currency. You cannot power a city with a spreadsheet. You cannot defend a nation with numbers on a balance sheet. This is why financial collapse so often precedes conflict. When trade fails, force replaces it. When money stops coordinating cooperation, power takes over. History shows us what survives these moments. Not paper assets. Not inflated balances. But real value. Land. Resources. Skills. Adaptability. The people who endure are not the ones who trusted the system to protect them. They are the ones who understood that stability is the exception, not the rule. The long peace that followed 1945 was an anomaly. A pause in a much older rhythm. Empires rise. They overextend. They borrow. They weaken. And eventually they collide. We cannot stop this cycle. But we can refuse to be blind to it. The signs are already visible. In the bond markets. In the headlines. In the fractures forming across the global economy. 2026 is just a date on a calendar. But the forces converging around it are real. Debt is real. Geopolitical tension is real. History is real. The world ahead will not look like the world behind us. An understanding that is the first step toward preparedness. This channel exists for one reason. To study these patterns. To connect the dots others ignore. And to help you see what is coming before it arrives. If you want to understand the forces shaping the future of money, power, and conflict, If you want history explained not as stories but as systems, subscribe to Finance Archives. Because if you know the pattern, you don't have to fear the outcome. You just have to be ready. The presses are running, the debt is growing, and history is beginning to rhyme once again. Stay alert, watch the markets, and prepare for the convergence.